Hello, everyone. I'm Chuki Lamo from speaking to you from India. I'm delighted to be moderating this session on how Tibetans fight to save their culture, organized by the Open Forum, an independent think tank that allows for open discussions on difficult issues. I'm also thrilled to be on the panel with three distinguished guests who are well known for their activism and resilience in the diaspora. We have John Jones, the campaign and advocacy manager at Free Tibet. Uh, Hello, John. Good evening there. And we are also joined by Chimilhamo, a youth activist and community organizer who also ran a very impressive campaign for councillor elections in Toronto. Hello, Chimi. Hi. We are supposed to be, Ladun Tethongla is also supposed to join us, but I guess we will start for the time being. We just saw a very emotional footage from Khamar Monastery, which showed how the authorities forced out practitioners out of the temple against their will. This is a footage from the Free Tibet organization. We'll be talking more about this with our first speaker, John Jones. Without further ado, I would like to request our first speaker, John, to speak on the recent report that Free Tibet put out, and also on the dispossession that Tibetans face inside Tibet. John, over to you.
Thanks, Chuki. So as you mentioned, on Monday, we launched a report called Desecration in Trangle County, and it details the siege that residents of the county were put under roughly between October 2021 and the summer of 2022. In creating the report, we also unearthed previous human rights abuses that took place in the area. And the significance of the report, as I'll detail shortly, is that it covers the full range of human rights abuses that Tibet groups have noticed over the decades. But it's not that it is an isolated and horrific case. It's more that what's happened to the residents of Trangle County is emblematic of the CCP's attempts to systematically eradicate Tibet's distinct way of life, its culture, religion, language, history. So the report focuses on one specific county. Trangle County is located in Kardze in eastern Tibet. Although if you look at a map that has Tibet on it these days, this county actually lies slightly outside of that. It's part of historic Tibet. Under the occupation, Tibet has been sliced up. The part known to most people as Tibet is only half of the territory. Trangle County is at the moment governed as part of Sichuan province. Despite this, the locals emphatically identify with Tibet and as Tibetans, and they have been punished in a range of ways, both for their resistance to the occupation and for their continued expression of their distinct Tibetan identity. In brief, the key findings of the report include abuses including the mass deployment of security forces, surveillance on the everyday lives of Tibetans, the destruction of religious and cultural heritage, targeted humiliation, punishing those who show dissent or reluctance to follow CCP orders with arrest and torture and re-education, and in some of the previous protests we examined, even killings. The events of the report focus around an area called Sandeng Village. And in October 2021, the newly appointed local officials toured the county, including this village, which they arrived at on the 30th of October 2021. And while they were in this village, they carried out inspections of things such as the local monastery, a Buddhist school that was important to the community for the complete both monastic and secular education it gave, and also a enormous Buddhist statue that the community had raised money to build, and that was unveiled in 2016 in the hope of holding off natural disasters that had afflicted the community in the past. After the tour, the government website of Trango County reported that officials had visited and they had inspected what they called land chaos and illegal construction sites. And the implications of this were made clear the next day, 1st of November, when a demolition order was issued targeting what they called illegal structures, and stating that the local government was simply implementing laws on planning, land administration, and safety. That pretext has very much been punctured by the manner in which the demolitions have been carried out and what they targeted. These demolitions were executed in a way that seemed calculated to cause as much distress and pain and humiliation as possible. And the first example of this was the school. So Drangungandin Monastic School, which had existed since 1990, was demolished on the orders of local officials. But the way they did it was that police summoned 2 senior monks from Drango Monastery to the county police station and told them that it was their job, these senior monks' job, to convince the local Tibetans to demolish the school themselves within 4 days, or there would be reprisals. So ultimately, residents had to dismantle one of the crown jewels of their community, this school, and video and photo emerged of residents taking apart the wood and carting it off until the school no longer stood. Authorities repeated this later that month. They summoned the same 2 senior monks, and this time they told them that they had to convince the local community to demolish 2 giant statues of the Buddha, including the one that I mentioned earlier, the 99-foot statue known as the People's Buddha that the community had raised funds to build. Officials repeated the same order. Local Tibetans had to destroy these statues themselves, and if they did destroy them, the sacred items inside the statues would be allowed to be kept by the community. If they did not fulfill the order, then those would be lost. And again, the statues were pulled down. This continued throughout December and early 2022. Another 30-foot statue was pulled down along with the temple housing it, this time citing fire safety. Local officials destroyed a building housing 45 large prayer wheels, another fundamental aspect of Tibetan Buddhism. Unless there be any doubt about what this was about, that there's nothing to do with fire safety, prayer flags that were hanging from the monastery were torn down and set on fire. Accompanying this cultural destruction was punishment of locals. At least 10 local Tibetans in Drango County were detained, some of them for reasons as minor as showing distress when they witnessed the statues being destroyed. And some of them were taken to a facility on the edge of town where they were subjected to a process called patriotic re-education, which generally has entailed Tibetans being forced to denounce their own Tibetan identity or their spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama. Again, an immensely distressing, very calculated thing to force Tibetans to do. This kind of punishment is not inflicted out of ignorance. It's inflicted out of knowledge about what makes Tibetans hurt and what they hold dear. All of this that I've just described very briefly is contained in more detail in the report, is immensely distressing. It's the intersection of various different kinds of cruelty, and it was summed up by one source who told us that it evoked the Cultural Revolution, both in terms of the damage it caused to the community and the pain inflicted on the residents. The report ends with a call to action. There's recommendations to various key actors, including national governments, that they can take to show genuine proactive support for the residents of Drango County and for Tibet more widely, including pushing their foreign missions to visit the site where the demolitions took place, calls for destroyed heritage to be restored strictly in accordance with the guidance and needs and wishes of the local community, for any remaining detainees to be released, and also for broader action to be taken to recognise that Tibetans' religious and cultural identity is under systematic attack, and the governments must support their freedom of religion and culture. And this international scrutiny can help. So, as we were concluding the report last year, it's taken over a year to compile this report. We learned that some of the prisoners that I mentioned earlier had been released, and that local officials who were unaccustomed to the level of scrutiny were scrambling to actually deny their involvement in the demolitions, which might be due to the international attention that the demolitions were getting. But it's also a first step. There's more work that can be done, and I hope that we can discuss this. And I think I'll leave my remarks there.
Thank you, John. As you said, it is very distressing to hear about all the reports that are coming out of Tibet. Since you spoke about the County, and I believe Free Tibet was one of the first to break the story in 2021. I wanted to know from you if you could talk about how you talk about the process of getting information from outside from inside Tibet, as it has become increasingly difficult to get any kind of information out or even verify sources. So could you share, or maybe share with us, some incidents that you have faced during the compilation of this report?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. For the benefit of viewers that maybe don't know so much about Tibet, I think one of the best ways to describe it is that the China researcher for Human Rights Watch, Sophie Richardson, in a conversation with one of my colleagues a few years ago, said that getting information out of Tibet is very much like getting information out of North Korea these days, both in terms of all of the difficulties for international NGOs, but also in terms of the risk posed to Tibetans inside Tibet if they try to communicate with the wider world. It's not really an option these days just to call up someone in Tibet and ask what they can see and what they've been going through. So there's been a transition across the Tibet movement, including by the other panelist groups, to carry out more open source research. So what we relied on with this report was interviewing former residents, satellite imagery, things such as local news reports and local government statements, which are often, on the one hand, propaganda, but on the other hand, give useful details about what the authorities are thinking. And then also there were some photos and videos which made their way from Drango County anonymously into the hands of groups, including Free Tibet. And it was just a case of, over this long period, corroborating information, building a profile of what happened in the county. And like I mentioned at the start, once we started interviewing, for example, former residents and combining the different sources, details didn't just come to light about what happened in 2021 and 2022, but also as far back as 2012 and 2008. And that's often the nature of research on Tibet. You don't find out about these abuses immediately. It takes time and patience, and increasingly it resembles detective work.
We'll be talking more about what you just said about uh, getting how difficult it has become increasingly to get any sort of information, be it about the families that you are talking about in your sources, or more information anywhere in Tibet, inside Tibet. So we next, I want to introduce the next speaker, Ladun Tedongla, who is the co-founder and director of Tibet Action Institute. We are joined today. Hello, hi, Laduna, and I want to request Laduna to weigh in on how Tibetans are struggling to preserve the language and culture.
Thank you so much. Apologies for being a little bit late. I'm unexpectedly not in my home office, but I am in Canada at my parents' home. So, yeah, this is the most important topic I feel like right now for Tibetans in many ways, as China's near total information blackout and lockdown of Tibet continues. It started and really went to the next level post 2008, and what we saw in 2008 was a historic uprising of Tibetans all across Tibet, not just what China calls Tibet, but actual historical Tibet, the entire plateau. And so 2008, since then, we've just seen an incredible level of really a sophisticated tools and tactics deployed, strategies used to not just keep Tibetans locked in, but keep the international community locked out. And at the same time, so now we don't hear a lot, like John was just talking about the difficulties of collecting the information and how long it took to write this report and the ways that we all have to try to get information out of Tibet right now. Um, it wasn't always like this. There used to be thousands of Tibetans who would escape every year um, out of Tibet into Nepal and India, and they were an incredible source of information of what was happening inside Tibet on the ground, what Chinese policies looked like. Unfortunately, the uh, lockdown, the effective blocking of Tibetans leaving, and really shutting out the international community almost completely since 2008, all accelerated under Xi Jinping, and especially after sort of the wave of Tibetan self-immolations that swept across Tibet from 2009, really in 2012 and 2013, picked up steam. And um, the response to that was vicious, fierce, and really under Xi Jinping, we've just seen Tibet cut off from the world in a way that's uh, unlike anything, almost any other place except North Korea, as John mentioned, in the world. And um, sadly, what's happening on the ground is an all-out assault on Tibetan language and culture and traditional ways of life, in sort of ways we haven't seen since everyone refers to since the Cultural Revolution. Really, for decades, there has been, to some degree, depending on the time, some amount of freedom and autonomy, not freedom, but some level of protections for Tibetan language or cultural practices, religion built into the system that, of course, are always flouted and always, overlooked. And Tibetans never have true safety and protection in being Tibetan in Tibet. But now under Xi Jinping, it's like the gloves are off. They don't even really pay lip service to the idea of regional ethnic autonomy, or they've just sort of overturned any existing ideas that Tibetans, even as an ethnic minority of China, which of course we're not, but we're an independent nation under illegal occupation. But the idea that Tibetans, even as a minority of China, should have some semblance of rights and freedoms to protect or promote Tibetan language and culture and Buddhism and whatnot, that's all kind of out the window under Xi Jinping. So since 2012, every year getting worse. And but the world doesn't know and can't really see clearly. and we can't get the information out in a really breaking news kind of way because Tibetans inside Tibet are so severely punished for sharing information, because there's no foreign media presence there, and because Tibetans aren't escaping in the thousands. I mean, maybe a dozen or so Tibetans can successfully escape from Tibet these days. So it means that Tibet's become a black hole for information, and under this enforced silence sort of cover of darkness, the Chinese government is engaged in a full-on cultural identity elimination campaign, full-on sort of genocidal policies, but they're not as easily seen and proven as they might be elsewhere. So just to get right to the issue that I've been working on, and that the movement, Tibet movement, is now really focused on along these lines, we have discovered a very broad, vast, and sinister residential school, colonial boarding school system in place in all of historical Tibet, not just in the Tibet Autonomous Region, as China calls Central Tibet. And we stumbled across this information in a way. We were looking into Tibet Action. We were looking into reports of children sort of forcibly sent away to boarding school from their parents unwilling to send them, but having to with no other choice. And sometimes very young children were included in these sort of accounts we were hearing from Tibet, but we weren't able to see any evidence online of an overall boarding school policy on the one hand for all of Tibet. But the Chinese government, there is information and propaganda that does show that increasing numbers of Tibetan children, students, have been put in boarding schools and newly built boarding schools and Education City outside of Lhasa over these years, corresponding to like the clampdown and the blackout. So while the Tibet was in a way going dark, they were constructing this and networking all of these boarding schools and sending more and more children to them. And what we've figured out by looking at openly available Chinese government sources, from the national level to regional, trying to piece together a picture, like kind of piecing together shards of glass to figure out what's happening. We sadly found and released a report just a little over a year ago that now what appears to be at least 78% of, according to the numbers that we could find, at least 78% of all Tibetan students between the ages of 6 and 18 now live in boarding schools. They're being raised by the Chinese government in boarding schools, separated from their families, from their traditional culture, religion, not speaking Tibetan language for the vast majority of their lives in these schools. They may have a Tibetan language class, but Mandarin is Chinese is the language of instruction. And that wasn't always the case in Tibet, certainly not for all age groups and not the very youngest children. And so, yeah, we're talking about at least 800,000 children and students. And sadly, we've also learned that it's not just the sort of grade 1, which is young enough, to graduation, high school graduation age, that are in boarding schools, but actually 4 and 5-year-olds go to, in rural areas, increasingly are being sent to boarding preschools. And that number, that program that these little tiny preschoolers sleep overnight in these schools, that is not known. The Chinese government has proudly proclaimed, preschool education, kindergartens opening all across China and then Tibet, and they show these day schools online, but they never admit that the kids in rural areas, and the vast majority of Tibet is rural, are increasingly being sent to boarding preschools against, of course, the wishes of their parents and families. But it's mandatory for them to attend, and that if they don't attend, I guess the threats are, you won't get to enter this child into school later. You'll lose social government, support or subsidies. A lot of very poor Tibetans rely on Chinese government sort of social welfare and other spending. And Tibetans inside Tibet know you can't say no, especially when a policy is coming from on high. And this is a national level push to put all so-called minority children into boarding schools so as to raise them first and foremost as Chinese. And the number of preschoolers, we have, an estimate from a Tibetan expert, eyewitness, academic, educational sociologist who fled Tibet a couple of years ago. And he's seen these preschools firsthand, and knows the whole boarding school system for Tibetans in Tibet. And he puts the number at least of 4 and 5-year-olds at about 100,000. But he said that's a very conservative estimate. So we're talking about probably 1 million Tibetan children, young people, our entire next generation, being raised by the Chinese state in residential boarding schools that, while different, say, than Canada and Australia and the US and others historically have used, colonial governments have used to destroy Indigenous culture or transform entire Indigenous societies so that they would conform or be a part of the mainstream white settler societies in Tibet. What we're seeing is just a different incarnation of this sort of genocidal policy, but with exactly the same intent, which is from the Chinese side, from Xi Jinping's side. You can see it in their policy proclamations over the last number of years, especially. They are attempting to wipe out Tibetan identity and replace it with a Chinese identity so that there will be no resistance to China's occupation of Tibet in the future. And that starts with the very youngest ones, with their roots, really breaking their connections to their home, to their families, to our ancient traditions, culture, Buddhist practices. And that's happening right now. We know it's happening. And we're trying to alert the world, because in conjunction with all the other destruction, and like John has outlined from their report, in conjunction with all of those broader policies, the future of Tibet is under threat. The survival of Tibet's ancient culture, identity, our traditions, our way of life, our very children, their being Tibetan on some level is all under threat right now, in a way that I think many people just don't realize, because of the information blackout and the total lockdown. And so our work right now is to get the word out, and we are doing it, and the movement's doing it. And this kind of discussion or opportunity to talk about it is critical. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ladula, for summarizing the comprehensive work that Tibet Action has done. You already touched upon what I was going to ask you on the report. The report compared these learning spaces inside Tibet with the indigenous schools that colonizers built in Canada, for example. But these schools are being built in Tibet today in the modern times. The report talks about parallels that these two oppressive systems have. But could you point out what is different in the structure that the Chinese government is currently imposing inside Tibet?
Sure. Yeah, I think the first thing would be, the first question we get asked about all the time is abuse and neglect, because of course that is, very much the horrific, one major part of the horrors of, say, in Canada, where I'm from, where I grew up, the residential boarding school systems that existed here. We don't know a lot about the situation for Tibetan kids in these schools and incidents of abuse and neglect, because Tibetans inside Tibet aren't free to report those, and doing so openly would be, or sharing that information with the world would be really risky for any Tibetans there. The other question we always get asked is, just about being forced. Parents are forced to send these children to these schools. So how is that? Um, or coerced, what does that look like? So they are not going and sort of taking the kids, dragging them from their parents, or the parents actually putting them in these schools. And what I would say there, on the one hand, the Chinese government has closed local schools or village schools, consolidated schools in such a way that Tibetan parents have no choice but to send their children to boarding school, to these residential schools, because the local options aren't there. And commuting, the incredible rural busing systems that we have here and elsewhere, those don't exist. Though they could and they should in many places, because it's not impossible to do. The roads are there, the so-called development is all there, but they really have made it, there are no choices. So on the one hand, Tibetan parents don't have a choice. Education, is compulsory, and they've made these preschool participation is essentially compulsory. But at the same time, Tibetans, the everybody is clear on what the consequences are. If you say no to the Chinese government, whether the local officials or all the way up the chain. And then, of course, parents want their kids to have an education, and they know they need to be educated and speak Chinese to live in the Tibet that China is creating, where you have to speak Chinese in order to have a job in the cash economy and survive. It's a really, really difficult and challenging life and environment for most Tibetans at this point to survive outside of any traditional ways of life. And even the traditional ways of life are just more and more difficult to live and survive with. And so parents send their kids because they have to, and they don't want their children to be left behind, or their families to be left behind. And then there are the cases we've heard about where people are literally forced, where local Tibetan private schools, the handful that exist, will be shut down, and all the kids, against the protests and the wishes of all the local people and the parents, will be rounded up. Parents will be forced to put them on the bus, and those who've tried to resist are threatened, intimidated, the whole thing. So it's a slightly complex picture, but not really in the end. I think if anybody is genuinely and meaningfully looking at the overall picture in Tibet, I think it's quite clear that most parents have no choice. And any parent, I'm a mother of 3 small children, and I can tell you, even sending my 6-year-old grade 1 to boarding school right now is unimaginable for me. And what separating from him now for essentially, except for holidays, maybe the rest of his childhood, is unbearable to think about. And Tibetans are no different. They don't want to send their kids away, let alone for most Tibetans, to the colonizer, in some cases, Tibetans will see outright to the Chinese as the enemy, as the oppressor. They don't want the oppressor raising their children, not speaking Tibetan language, and raising them as strangers to them. So, it's not the same as, say, in Canada exactly as in the past, but the overall goals of the Chinese government and the features of heartache and pain for Tibetans are very similar.
Thank you, Hadila, for highlighting how difficult it is for children to learn their own mother tongue. Now we have a last speaker, third speaker, Chimilamula. I invite Chimi to join the discussion of how Tibetans are striving to keep their culture alive. Over to you, Chimi.
Thank you, Gisela, everybody. When I first read the topic, I wanted to reiterate and revisit the title and redefine what culture is and how do we collectively define culture. So culture has various definitions. However, when we look at it from the derivation of an anthropological perspective, it is often referred to as the way of life for an entire society. Culture, in this sense, has this understanding of the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes members of one group to another society or another category of people. It's also the ways in which we collectively act, think, and feel. And there's no doubt that the colonial rule over over our Tibet by the Chinese Communist Party is attacking in every way all of the various aspects of our culture. From severing our ties as a young Tibetan who was born in exile, severing our ties to our own cousins and our own brothers and sisters inside of Tibet, where Tibetans inside of Tibet can't leave and we can't access Tibet. In addition to, of course, the information blackout, as my colleagues have mentioned, which is by design and intentional, to a point where even Tibetans who sent money to India were imprisoned and had to pay the price of their life. When it comes to the Tibetan identity, there are three pillars that we like to define it as. First and foremost, in no particular order, there is our nomadic way of life, our religion, and our language. And when it comes to the nomadic way of life, millions of Tibetan nomads have been relocated into concrete blocks, completely destroying our indigenous ways of practicing and preserving and stewarding the lands that we have. Additionally, when it comes to language, we've already heard from the colonial state-run boarding schools and what Aladullah was mentioning about the real situation inside of Tibet when it comes to our children and our next generation. Religion, the Drago County destructions are just one example of what's been happening inside of Tibet. We've been hearing about the destruction of Larungar and Yangchungar and the relocation of nuns and monks, and not only just eviction of these monks and nuns, it was re-education camps again being implemented for the nomads, for the monks and nuns, and we see that now with our children. Gaurav, if you don't mind pulling up that picture, I want us to visit this image, which is defined as the manifestation of culture at different levels of depth. See, it's a common picture that is often identified when we look at it, when we look at culture, the sort of onion image, starting from symbols. Many of the artifacts, the statues, the religious heritage sites serve as symbols of our cultural identity. When we see, and we've heard from John and the Tongwa report of the destruction of and the attack that the Chinese government has been posing on our symbols. Heroes, no doubt, they're always trying to find a way to delegitimize His Holiness. That's a given. But in addition to that, with China's long arm tactics that exist in not just, of course, the pressure inside of Tibet, but also overseas, even in places like Canada. And we also know from the recent report by Safeguard Defenders of the existence of Chinese police stations that are illegally operating in over 50 countries that are still currently open, most of them. So here's a call to action. And then rituals. Rituals cannot survive without the symbols, the heritage, the artifacts, and our heroes and the folks that are preserving the culture. How can rituals be continued to be practiced if there are no people that have the understanding that ultimately allow us to understand the nuances and practices of our traditions? And then we have at the core the values. The values and practices go similar, hand in hand. Values are more sort of internal, and practices are more external. And external practices are much more visible, right? And that is pretty clear. I don't think we need to further explain the colonial rule of the Chinese government on the Tibetan people and the Tibetan lands. However, when it comes to values, that is very internal. The fact that these colonial state-run boarding schools are not just teaching how to read and write in Chinese instead of Tibetan, they're even teaching the children how to psychologically dream, imagine. And these are the insidious tactics that the Chinese government is using to inherently change the values of our next generation. I remember actually hearing Dr. Gallo giving an example of an analogy. Young Tibetan children, when they are growing up in our Tibetan nomadic lands, if we had a goat, the values of the Tibetan children are such that if someone handed them a pale, which is a Tibetan bread, their instinct is to automatically share with the goat, half to the goat and half for themselves. And now the change and the shift in the value system of these children have become where these children are being taught that if you get a piece of bread, not only do you eat the bread on your own, but if you're hungry, you eat the goat too. And so that is an analogy. Thank you for the picture, Gaurav. However, today I just want to use the rest of my time to emphasize the message of hope, because Tibetans, despite all that is happening, we continue to thrive. So for us, and for me, the fact that Tibetans are continuing to not just survive, but thrive in different ways to fight for the survival of our culture, the land, our identity, and our people, is resistance. Our existence becomes resistance. And in addition to that, we have seen the brave, courageous Tibetans inside of Tibet that continue to time and time again rise and create different forms of acts of resistance, engage in strategic nonviolence actions. And we see climate environmentalists and educators such as like Go Sharap Gyatso, Anya Sendrak, right now facing both of them a 10 years prison sentence. And we also have folks in exile, the amplifiers of the voices inside of Tibet, organizers and activists that are doing the work time and time again, despite the fact that it's exhausting and tiring. It's we keep going on. There's a reason why we keep going on. And there's a saying in our Tibetan community that every Tibetan born after 1959 is born an activist. And this is why. And not just in these explicit ways. Tibetans here, at least in Toronto, locally, every Wednesday in the morning at 8:30 a.m., we'll see a bunch of Tibetans at the Chinese embassy. Well, as these Chinese officials are entering their office, you bet Tibetans are reminding them of the truth. And then in the evenings, we gather in hundreds. In the summertime, actually, more than 200-300 people, children as young as 3 years old, but as old as 90, are dancing together in intergenerational conversations, gathering, and just share of love. We engage in Lakar, a homegrown movement that began inside of Tibet, using Wednesday as a day to preserve their culture by eating, speaking, wearing Tibetan, supporting local Tibetan businesses. So hope is very much alive, and not only hope, we continue to act on that hope. And last message would be for the allies, is that the Tibetans are continuously doing what they can and going beyond, actually, in many ways, to preserve their culture, despite all that is happening. But there is a role that each and every single one of you who's viewing has to also play as an ally, is to show up. The definition of allyship is not a badge that can be worn. It's an active, consistent, arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluation, and ultimately showing up for the people that are affected, the communities that are affected, and giving them the agencies to speak the truth. So calls to action from the Chonggo report. Let's talk about visits to Chonggo to be able to see what's happened in these regions. We want to call all levels of government to call for the shutdown of these colonial state-run boarding schools. The violence and the result of these schools is very clear. And oftentimes we hear ourselves saying, oh, like, we should never again, hashtag never again. But here's our time to act now, and let's get to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chimi, for that moving presentation of yours. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll make it brief. Chimila, I wanted, with regards to you, I wanted to ask you about activism. As you just mentioned, how Lakar is celebrated in Toronto. You were there at the protest at the opening ceremony in Athens, where your protest with two of your peers was monumental for media for Tibetans all around the world. Uh, my question is to you is, even though we are a new generation, and we would like to think that in the free world we are free to make our statements, show our dissent, but it still feels like it is quite a struggle to challenge China on a global scale. How do you think we can counter that?
Is to address the reality of complacency. Silence is in the in times of injustice is very much the injustice itself, and we see that with all of the international bodies when they choose trade and profit over people, time and time again. Even just to get a meeting with senior officials seems to be a challenge, because even if they personally want to meet with us, it is that the priorities of the current government, or the pressures that come into their offices, create an obstacle and barrier for us to be able to even get a platform to speak about the reality. So I think the way to overcome that is to really challenge the complacency of all of the bodies. And we do that by equipping ourselves with, first and foremost, understanding the situation inside of Tibet properly. And that's really challenging, as we've already mentioned about the information blackout. But to the best of our ability, and that is when we have the agency, the community has the agency to speak for themselves the truth that of their own truths. That's first. Second is to equip ourselves with the connections and networks to be able to access the spaces of power and privilege, and if not access to the spaces of power and privilege, to be those people that have access to power and privilege ourselves, whether it is running for office or whether it is just doing well in whatever way possible. I think there's always a way for us to give back to our communities, and for as long as you're continuing to do better and better, there are always going to be ways that we can push our respective governments to do better. And as a citizen, should we have that privilege, we can engage in various actions, such as writing to your local MP to engage in this priority. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jimmy. So we will quickly move on to the Q&A session. There are many questions coming on from different platforms. There is one question asking how Taliban, when Taliban destroys symbols of cultural heritage, everyone seems to notice that. But when Chinese government destroys a Buddhist statue, nothing much is said. Why do you think so? Do you think can John take that up?
Well, so I think that outrage against cultural destruction or any human rights abuse can only follow if people actually hear about it. The destruction of the Bamyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, it's an obvious parallel, both in terms of the fact that it was Buddhist statues that were destroyed, but also I believe it was exactly 20 years earlier in 2001. The Taliban, as I recall, announced this in advance and broadcast it, and made it very clear that they were the ones doing it. They didn't hide in the way that China, and certainly in Triangle County, did. I mentioned earlier that there were all these nonsense pretexts around fire safety and land use, many of which don't stand up to scrutiny. And there was also the fact that the police forced locals to do their dirty work for them. But I think the key thing is also just that what we kept going back to, that getting information out of Tibet is incredibly difficult. These are hidden crimes waiting to be unearthed, and it takes the combination of brave people in Tibet sending information about them, but also the detective work that NGOs do. The other factor to this is that Afghanistan in 2001 was an isolated, largely friendless government. I believe only 3 countries even recognise the Taliban government. China is not only widely recognised, it's widely feared. This puts real limits on what governments are prepared to do to express outrage against them. My first step, my recommendation would be to share the findings of the report so that other people hear about what's been happening in Drongo County and across Tibet, and then they can join the questioner in their outrage and ideally in their desire to take some action in response.
Thank you, John, for taking that on. There's another question asking if Tibetan parents and child clash on values, those who go to the boarding schools. Can Harun take that on?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. From everything we've heard, and it makes sense to me just as a Tibetan kid who was born and raised in Canada with, living in my home with my Tibetan father. It's inevitable on some level when we live in exile outside of our own land. But in Tibet, I think you have, what I understand is that so many of the parents, even the ones who really wanted this sort of push for all Tibetan children to be educated, they wanted it to work. They sent their children very young, and they just did it almost praying and hoping that it was going to give their kids some chance, some advantage, that the Chinese language would really be helpful for them. And we've heard testimonials where, these individuals really regret it because, of course, the kids come home on their limited vacation time and they're different. They're still Tibetan and they're still their parents' children, but they're being raised in a completely different value system, as Chimila was just talking about. And the Buddhists, they don't, even if they have those Buddhist cultural foundations, which is not going to be the case for many of the children now as they're going younger and younger. But they're living in a completely different world, and they're being taught the Chinese, it's not just Chinese language, it's the education, it's the system, it's the values in the system, it's this, Communist Party ideology and everything, that materialism, that different idea of what it takes to be successful in the modern world and under the Chinese system, or what it takes for Tibetans, an idea of a successful person traditionally and in terms of Buddhist values will just be totally at odds. And so I understand we talk about the boarding schools, not just the trauma of separation and the heartache and the homesickness, or the lasting, the language loss, cultural erasure. The breakdown of society, this is one thing Dr. Gello, the Tibetan education expert with 30 years of experience inside Tibet, talks about, the implications for society when parents and children, grandparents and children, elders, and all the young generation just have a different mentality. They're really profound, and they're bound to cause conflict, intergenerational conflict in the family. And it's not that I would never say that these kids are not Tibetan, nor will they be Tibetan. What I would say is that they're living, they're being raised to be strangers from their own people and culture. They're going to have to work very hard in their future lives to get back what is being stolen from them. And that's not easy. And there is a price to pay now. and there will be a price to pay going forward. And, if I could just relate one story, Dr. Gallo tells us in his own family, he saw firsthand how little ones sent to a boarding preschool just after months were communicating mainly. They spoke only Tibetan until they went. Their mother speaks only Tibetan. They went to this boarding preschool. They returned home, multi-generational family setting, of course, and they were acting like strangers in their own homes. And they were not participating in the family conversation. And what Dr. Gallo was told later, he observed this in his own family with his own eyes, and what he always says is that's not unique from all his travels and his talks with Tibetans and families. This is very common. Now, that's not to say every Tibetan kid will just separate from their family. Family's family. Kids need their amlas, their mothers and their fathers and their grandparents and their extended family networks, no matter what. But there will be a lot of sadness and pain and suffering and alienation that's happening, that is happening right now, and that will continue to happen. And we only need to look at the Tibetans who have spoken about their lives and experiences in boarding schools, through the older incarnations of boarding schools, either in Tibet itself, because they have existed for years, just not in this kind of really totally sort of centralized and completely all-encompassing compulsory kind of way. But Tibetans who grew up in Chinese boarding school, either in China or in Tibet, talk about the difficulties and the emotional toll and the psychological toll and the impact it had to be both Tibetan in an environment where you're not valued, or everything Tibetans are looked at as backwards. China is modern, Tibet is backwards. Tibetans are superstitious. The Chinese have ingenuity and all of just every negative possible framing for traditional Tibetan way of life or thinking is put on Tibetans. And so there's a price to pay there. And then when they return home and their Mandarin is stronger than, their Chinese is stronger than their Tibetan, or they've spent more time in sort of Chinese society than Tibetan society, or in their own family, that just inevitably creates really, really painful fissures and breakages with relationships and obstacles just to be you and your own family. And I think that it's heartbreaking. So it goes so much beyond just the idea of, which is already, heavy and horrific enough, cultural erasure. It's just like, what does this mean on a personal level? That absolutely breaks my heart, because I can see in my own children how quickly, when they go to daycare or they start school, even when they're coming home every evening, that life starts to take on such a powerful influence over them. And we only have so much time with them at the end of day after school or on the weekends. And for Tibetans inside Tibet now, they don't even have that. A lot of these kids can't even go home on the holidays if it's too expensive, too difficult. They'll go stay with relatives if their family is too far away. It's really devastating what this means for interpersonal, familial relationships and society overall. Because it's not just one or two, it's a mass scale. You think every Tibetan family is affected by this now in a major way.
That's right. Thank you, Ladin, for bringing perspective to this very difficult systematic oppression happening inside Tibet. I think, relate to this as well, even though I'm a Tibetan born here in exile. I think I missed one question. I think Chimi can take this on. So someone asks, is there a reason Western governments don't seem to care or take action on clear human rights abuses inside Tibet?
I think, firstly, I mentioned already the complacency, right? When the priorities are different for various governments, oftentimes they place their own priorities and importance first before human rights, even though they sign on to various declarations and agreements saying, oh, human rights are going to be placed first. Realistically speaking, oftentimes they put their trade and money over human rights. So that's already clear. But in addition to that, we've talked about it a little bit in this conversation already. It's what the Chinese government has done in the past 2 decades, right? Complete lockdown of Tibet. The information blackout has allowed for the Western media, or Western governments, the international world to continue to stay quiet on it, because now there is no data that we can provide to them to remind them of the realities of Tibetans inside of Tibet, apart from the recent reports. For a long time, for me, even as an advocate going to lobby weeks, it was again the same narratives, because we knew it was happening. We know as Tibetans what we're facing, the erasure in every level, but to be able to prove it in numbers and quantifiable reports, or ways to materialistically define the genocide that's taking place, was challenging for us, because we had no access to our own country. There is no information access. So one of the first and most basic steps, it feels like we're going back to square one, is calling for international governments to be able to access Tibet, for unfettered access to Tibet, to be able to actually investigate. The numbers that we see about the colonial state on boarding schools is still, in to many degrees, an estimate. And we still haven't even heard or seen a report about the preschool, which is absolutely ridiculous. And the fact that it's happening in this day and time in the world. So really goes back to being able to even just have basic access for independent journalists to be able to enter Tibet, to see what's happening on the grounds. It could be so much worse than what we have right now, and I believe it is much more worse. And so far, these two reports that talk about Tongo and our Tibetan children, there are all of these other things that are happening, from our political prisoners, the environmental destruction. How many more reports should we create for the world to see? I think it's about time for the world and these international governments to go and see themselves. So
Thank you, Chimi. I think I have a question for 1 second. I think John could take this on. Does China make it difficult for tourists to visit Tibet?
China does make it difficult for tourists to visit Tibet, and they don't just limit it to tourists either. First of all, I think we're going to have to go back to this distinction between what Tibet is on a map and what actually is Tibet. The half of Tibet governed as the Tibet Autonomous Region is incredibly difficult to access. Every so often we'll get an email from a journalist who's about to embark on a journalist's tour of Lhasa, for example, or other parts of the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region, where they will be given minders and shown around, but they have no free rein to explore themselves, to interact with Tibetans freely. They very much see what the Chinese government wants them to see. That also applies to diplomats, international governments, human rights experts, the UN. Nobody is getting into the Tibet Autonomous Region without China's express approval and without being shepherded around. There's slightly more leeway in the parts of Tibet that are currently under the administration of Sichuan or Qinghai province. For example, Jamila mentioned the name Larungar in her presentation, which is another monastic community where somewhere in the region of at least 5,000 residents were forcibly expelled and their residences destroyed. It also happens to be a very beautiful, striking-looking site, and so there have been journeys by tourists to access that site in recent years, and a report that Free Tibet and Tibet Watch collaborated on. A lot of the information, a lot of the photos came from a tourist who happened to have a Chinese passport who was able to get in and walk around. And their experience was that they were far freer to walk around as tourists than the monks and the nuns were on the site itself. So I think, in conclusion, I would say yes, but don't just limit it to tourists. It's anyone that might put any scrutiny or report back from what they saw in Tibet that has a hard time getting in.
Right. Thanks so much, John. I think we have a video question coming in. I think, could we play it?
What is the way forward, especially when the young Tibetans are being brainwashed?
I'm happy to start. I'll try to be more succinct. And I guess one way to think about this that has been helpful for me, and just not what I would have thought off the bat, that I've gained sort of this insight from Dr. Gello, the Tibetan education expert who fled Tibet recently. He was talking about the idea that these, Tibetan children now completely growing up outside of traditional Tibetan culture, and with that connection to Buddhist teachings, values, nonviolence, that compassion, all of the ideas that and the values that are rooted in Tibetan children from a young age. They're all there. And if you're not with your family, if you're not in a traditional cultural setting, if you can't access Buddhism at all, and then you're going to they're growing up with a really nationalistic, because the boarding schools don't just, try to erase the Tibetan side. They try to implant this very strong sort of political education and ideology in the children that is, it's really, for young children, it's crazy kind of political brainwashing at a very young age. But what it does is it gives them a very strong sense of this nationalistic kind of feeling and center, but they're not Chinese. And when they go into the world and try to live in China, or, under Chinese rule, Tibetans aren't accepted as Chinese. Tibetans are not allowed to just go and be equal to Chinese. They experience discrimination at every turn, and their education is not very good, from what we understand, in a lot of places. So it's kind of a lie. It's all just a lie that they're being fed and raised on. And they will have their political awakenings or their political sense that will come to them with this very nationalistic education and foundation being drilled into them. And when they look for who they are, as most young people eventually do, or with any flashpoint or political unrest, they will turn that frame that they're being raised in and that ideology to being Tibetan. But they won't have all those cultural values, and the Buddhist, all of that will not be as strong, that rooting. Mm-hmm. And so China's going to have an even, maybe not a bigger problem, but an equally difficult problem. I mean, they're not stamping out future resistance. I think they're probably just stoking a stronger, perhaps less sort of what we would think of as a nonviolent resistance, and more of a forceful idea for young Tibetans that they have a right and a place in the world, that their nationality, which is Tibetan, even if you've stripped all the features, in the end, they're Tibetan, and they won't be treated as equals in China. So in the People's Republic of China. And so what that will mean in the future, I think the Chinese government is yet again sort of shooting itself in the foot when trying to solve one problem, quote unquote. They're creating a whole new one. And that's going to be true for Uyghurs and others,
Thank you, Rajan. So we don't have it, and this is a very important question as well. I think Chimi can take this on, since exiled Tibetans are now It's been 60 years and more. Tibetans here in the diaspora are trying more and more to preserve language and culture, even though there are different forces, difficult forces, and aspects to consider. So Chimi, can you take on this question? So the question is: are there any Tibetan culture focused schools outside of Tibet in the diaspora?
Yeah. Thanks to the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and his visionary leadership, both in a political and spiritual perspective, at the beginning, at the beginning of TCV, the Tibetan Children's Village, which is the school that has basically raised the first generation of Tibetans that came into exile. The wave of Tibetans in all three generations of exilehood have, in many ways, majority of them come out of TCV. And TCV serves as the pillar of education within the education department of our Central Tibetan Administration. And many Tibetans who have been able to flee Tibet and come into exile, children who are basically semi-orphaned by coming into exile to access education. So TCV serves at that as that place of education center. So children, as young as preschool to grade 12 get educated at the TCV and partnered Tibetan schools all across India in various settlements. So the initial ones of lower TCV and upper TCV resides in Dharamsala, India, but we have various chapters in South, in near Mysore, and various states across India. So these are, I would say, the center educational institutions of Tibetans, main go-tos, where they learn how to read and write and speak in Tibetan as the medium of instruction up until a certain grade, I believe grade 6, and then they transition into English and other languages. That's there. But in addition to that, there are various other institutions that have come forth because of the Tibetans in exile and the work that they've been doing, thanks to the work of our ancestors. So outside of India and Nepal, there are various Sunday schools that have been implemented in all of the diaspora communities across the world, in Europe and North America specifically. So here in Toronto, every Sunday we have our Sunday school where Tibetan children are able to go for the whole day. From morning till afternoon, they get to learn the language. And we have a curriculum that has been agreed upon and created by Tibetan teachers and revisited by editing and reevaluating the curriculum every year by Tibetan teachers across the world during their teachers' meeting. So morning till afternoon, they learn the language, and the afternoon onwards, they're actually taught by ex-TIPA. TIPA is the Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts. So former artists from that institution who live all across the world end up becoming teachers of Tibetan performing arts at our local schools. And so here you see this organic, but also such a powerful, unmovable pieces of our culture that is being preserved and celebrated. And thanks to these institutions, right now, when I go on a Wednesday, I see young 14, 15-year-olds who are not just dancing Tibetan dance, who are born in, mind you, they're born in Canada. Not only are they dancing, they're choreographing new Tibetan songs that just came out of Tibet. So they are finding creative ways to stay not only updated, but like aligned, some telepathic connection of through art and creative expression. And so that type of resistance is happening in terms of school and education in exile. And of course, now we also see the spread of Tibetan Buddhism in the West, and that has resulted to various educational departments in universities. So there's a lot of Tibetan Buddhist programs all across the world, in North America and Europe, but they're predominantly run by white folks, which I think is another place for us to challenge that notion, because again, it goes back to the community having agency, and also the West being able to see what the real deal is by having Tibetan teachers.
I think, thank you so much, Chimi, for that answer. And on that note, we'll close the session. I think Ladu had to leave because of family emergency. So lastly, I just want to thank you all. Thanks to the wonderful speakers. Thank you to the questions from the audience, and thank you to Lavina and Gaurav for taking me on as the moderator. This is first time that I'm doing this on a webinar. So thank you so much. I wish to be part of more conversations like this, and wish to be talking to you, John and Chimi, in the future. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you for the moderation. You were wonderful.
Thanks.
It's good working with you.
Cheers.
Bye. Yeah.